All right, let's see. All right, we're live. So chill.
Hi.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so let me just set this up. Let people know who we are, and we're about to get started. There are a bunch of people in the chat. Keep the chat going this whole time. Saint Antonio, raise up. Thank you for showing up. And let me introduce myself and kind of what we're doing today. So, hello, everyone. My name is Jodi-Ann Burey. I'm a speaker, I'm a writer who works at the intersections of race, culture, and health equity. A big part of my work, or at least a huge part that brings me joy, is my partnership with oneKIN, which is an online marketplace that has all types of small businesses, all owned by people of color. What I've been doing with them is curating a book list that we're calling the Lit Lounge. It's 4 p.m. where I am, but I did want to have some time zone inclusivity for everyone else.
Yes.
So we can get lit as we talk about Olga Dies Dreaming with Xochitl Gonzalez. And so what I've been trying to do with this Lit Lounge, and this is our first event of our second iteration of the list, is to really highlight incredible authors of color who are writing memoirs, short story collections, novels, just work that is really showing the nuances of our lives as people of color across race and ethnicity, that I think and that I hope talks about like a broader cloth, right? More intricate cloth of who we are, without always centering like anti-racism and, all this discrimination and bias that we face. Yes, that is a part of our lives. But for us, I don't ever really want to start there. This has way more nuance and context and breadth of our experiences than a lot of the important work, but different work that talks about our life experiences. And so I am I cannot even express to y'all. I considered spending just the next 60 minutes just clapping for Xochitl this whole time and not even asking a damn question.
Which would be very boring for everybody else, but thank you.
But it would be so important for me because, like, when I finished that book, that I literally stood up and I was like, "Yes, girl." So I would love to introduce Xochitl Gonzalez, who is the author of Olga Dies Dreaming, also the executive producer of an upcoming TV adaptation of this book. And I cannot wait for this discussion. I am bursting. And if you feel like, Xochitl, that I am about to give something away, please let me know, because I don't want to spoil it for everyone, but I am incredibly excited about this book and the craft of writing, the business of writing, and a lot of the themes that came out of your work. And so welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm like so loving your enthusiasm, and like, no, I think at this point I feel like online there's a lot of like weird spoilers. I think other than the very end, most things are not like spoilers, but it's funny because I love your enthusiasm, and I'm so excited for this conversation. And I think one of the things that's been a criticism that I've actually thought has been a badge of honor that I've seen on like Goodreads, or like this weird thing that happens on Instagram where people tag you on a bad review, which I'm like, why did you tag me?
I don't need that violence in my life. Thank you.
But like what some people have said is they're like, there's just so much going on. And I thought to myself, but that's living as a woman of color in America, like, and having a family and an extended family and business. Like, and I the intention was that I don't think it was to make it chaotic as much as it was to represent the chaos that can happen in moments of, particularly in moments of crisis, which I think when you have a larger family that can stumble upon you at any moment, actually, like crisis can happen at any moment and you're really never waiting for it, like expecting it. And so I just sort of thought, like, I don't know, like I'm happy to hear you say this is like about the nuance of like living, because I really did want to write about that experience, flesh it out. But like, I remember being in the Hamptons because I couldn't go to Puerto Rico for I had to cancel my 40th birthday trip because of the hurricanes, and watching the news footage and being like, this is not just a news story. So like, anyway, but I will let you I will let you be Jodi-Ann because you're wonderful.
So I know, I appreciate that. And I actually want to start there. At some point, I do want to delve into, there's a section towards the end where two characters are in conversation. One person says anarchy and the other person says agency.
Yeah.
And that is kind of what I see in the construction of this book. There is so much going on, right? There is a lot of anarchy. That is kind of how life is, right? But what happens to you along your journey when you realize your own agency and kind of marionetting like some of the aspects of your life and the things that you cannot do that for, but I think also your own agency, right? In kind of making sense and building this world that, again, is based on those. There are some parts that are inspired from your own life. There's a huge chunk of it that is deeply, deeply grounded in current events, in history, in Puerto Rican history specifically. But also, it's still a fictionalized world that you have put together in this masterful way that I could literally feel like I was in Sunset Park. I can feel myself in these spaces. And that is an experience, especially as a woman of color, as a Black person, as a Black New Yorker from Queens, as a Black New Yorker from Queens who was born in Jamaica and like kind of has this similar diasporic experiences as a lot of the characters do. It sat like on me, in me, through me. And I just like your talent to just having some agency over that story is absolutely incredible. And so thank you so much for your work.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. You know what's can we talk about anger? I don't know, like it's really,
yes.
as you're looking at that, like one of the first things that I decided to fictionalize, because my parents were activists and I was raised by my grandparents. But one of the first things I decided to fictionalize was making her get left later. Like I was left with my grandparents at 3 and she's left at 13. And part of it, and part of what, when we're talking about being from Queens and me writing about Brooklyn and part, I wrote it partially, and I feel like I wrote this book kind of fast, but it was because I felt very much like pissed off. Does that make, like, I was really angry. Like I was like really angry. I'm still angry. Like I still get mad like when people talk about a Brooklyn writer and I'm like, this person got here 6 minutes ago. And it's not to say that people aren't allowed to move, but I'm like, but that is not what Brooklyn, like just living in a fancy part of Brooklyn and having plopped here 6 months ago, does it make you a Brooklyn writer? You're a writer who lives in Brooklyn, like, and that's cool. But like, I think it was this co-opting of this place that had made me, in general, not just in writing, like in general, and this like sort of like taking over it and putting a trademark at the end, and like, and now it's this other thing that I decided that I was like, well, if I make the character a little older, she can have the freedom to be a little bit more pissed off. Like, I don't think me as a person, like, I wasn't given a lot of room to have a lot of opinions about. I think a lot of people in like sort of like ethnic households, like cultural households, I don't think we're given a lot of room to have a lot of anger. I don't know, like it's probably a better way to put it. Like, I was definitely just like, well, like literally, like I ever was like, but what about my mom? My grandma's like, you don't like it? Like it's like oh, you don't like being here? Like it's like, and I'm like, okay, like, I didn't say that. I'm just like asking like about the same, but you weren't given the room for that. And I think I wanted to write a character that had the space to be a little bit more pissed off, like, and that was weirdly a great place to start from, because I think it enabled you to have more acerbiveness than I ever do in real life. Yeah.
And I think what I found really important too about Olga and her brother Prieto, like they're in their early to mid 40s when we meet them in the book, right? And what's so powerful about that age is you have a level of agency and resources that if you want to go a different direction in your life, you can do that with a lot more confidence and resources than you would maybe at 20 years old, right? And so I loved just like how intentional I felt you were around what phases of their life, a lot of the transitions that the characters are going through, it's actually realistic and possible because of where they are.
Well, I think that is one of the things, we were chatting a little bit about this too, is like, it was really important to me. I don't want to like, there have been a lot actually, to be completely frank, there have not been enough Latinx books. There have not been enough Caribbean Latinx books. Like there have just not been enough. And one of the things I wanted to do is really write an kind of American book, because on both sides of my family, my dad's side of my family is Mexican American, but from South Texas. So like there was like a border and then they were American. Like, like there was like a border and they were American. Like no one in any side of my family decided to become American in the way that this sort of like, Statue of Liberty narrative, Ellis Island narrative is told. And I think that that's a really interesting thing, because it changes your relation to something. Like it's, and so I wanted to write an American story where it's a family that's been in New York for a while. And that was important to me, but it was also sort of like, I don't know, like, I think it was like really important to me that they be characters that have agency versus like this idea of like, where there's still a power struggle and a power dynamic. And there are people at play that have way more, that are operating at puppeteer level, which is true in life, by the way. Like it's like absolutely true in life. Like I think some of these things, I remember writing them and being like, oh, I'm worried, is this going to seem like out of the realm of realistic fiction? And then like 2 days later, I'd see a crazy headline in the news, like about the Trump administration. I was like, we're not, like, it's totally, totally plausible. But I think the idea that there are people with some power, with some agency, that there is like, even if you were to talk about Prieto's character, who's like a compromised politician without totally getting too into it, but like he is compromised, but he's able to cover up that compromise because he has a certain amount of power.
Yes.
And I think that I had not seen enough articulation of characters with agency, with social capital, with some of the things that come with, and there's so many different degrees of social capital. Like, I purposely wrote, like, I thought a lot about colorism when I was writing the book. I spent a lot of time thinking about it, because when I was younger and we applied to Brown, we had to put our like photos with our application.
Oh yeah, that was in the Wayback Machine.
Oh, the Wayback Machine, the massive Wayback Machine, like massive Wayback Machine. But it's all to say, like, of course, then when you get on campus, everybody is totally like very light skinned, like for the most part, very, very light skinned. And you're like, well, of course, because like somebody's looking at photos and implicit bias and all these things that we just never talk about or whatever. And I wanted to talk about how that affects even within a family, like it's like the brother is like the darker one, Prieto, and then he ends up going into public service, right? Like it's like Mabel, like is like just as smart, but never gets as like, like whatever. And I think the idea is that I wanted to write a character that was cognizant of versus just existing. And I think I had it, I'd not necessarily seen the hyper awareness, and I just felt that she would have it. Like I felt she would have it because I knew that I had it. And those are some of the things that I guess are autobiographical, if that makes sense. Like I wanted to make sure that Reggie was there, because I feel like too often that to me was a very New York thing. Like I thought that was such like my ex-sister-in-law, I always remember it. Like she showed up at she used to work at like an investment bank or whatever. And she showed up at the Latin employees caucus, and they were like, what are you doing here? Because she like presented as just purely what people think of as an African-American. They're like, they meet on Tuesdays. And she's like, no. But I think it's a very New York experience. And I just I don't know. I hadn't seen it as that idea of, I don't know. I wanted to talk about that without making that be what the book is about. Does that make sense?
No, it absolutely makes sense. And I want to speak to that because I've seen, and in your response, if you want to give a summary for Olga Dies Dreaming for folks, I think a lot of people in the chat are engaging with it as if they read it, which is great. But if you haven't read it, at least get people to level set on what's about and who all the characters are. Yes. But what I think about that, when I see descriptions of the book, like gentrification is always kind of somewhere in the description. And when I try to describe the book to people, I find it very difficult to give like a 1 or 2 sentence description because it's so much richness. And so, yes, gentrification is a part of this, but is it directly about gentrification, not really. And so I looked up the definition of gentrification, and it's defined as the process of making someone or something more refined, polite, or respectable, right? And so I think, or I experience also as a woman of color and a woman of color who's from another country, right? Like that, to be refined, polite, and respectable is to be in closer proximity to white men, right? And whiteness, and like in that culture, right? And I think a lot of the characters in the book are being forced to contend with like big G gentrification, like gentrification
100%.
of Brooklyn, gentrification of Puerto Rico, right? But they're also all contending with like a little G gentrification of like how we align ourselves, with our values, kind of our histories, the things that we care about, in contrast to, like, as you describe in the book, like the accoutrement of the bourgeoisie, right?
That's right.
And so I see this somewhat you talk about this mug from Olga's undergrad, right?
Yeah.
And in the beginning of the book, it's a source of pride. Like, I still have my Boston College mugs. I still have my Boston College sweatshirts. I strategically use those sweatshirts when I need to go see doctors for the first time, but that's a different story.
Oh my God, that is brilliant and fucking tragic. Jesus. Yes.
But then towards the end of the book, she has a very different relationship with what that mug represents. And so, can you speak to, as you described the book, one, what it is, but like this kind of sense of gentrification in this direct and smaller way, but maybe also the ways that gentrification doesn't even fully capture like what this book is about.
So it's funny because like now that it's been out and I've been talking about it for like 6 months, like I used to say that it was about gentrification and colonialism, but the more that I've kind of mused on it, I've decided that it's about colonialism, because colonialism relies on replacement. And if you want to hear me get bitter, what gets me really bitter is that I remember coming back from college and not like getting stranded at something and having to take a cab, but you never did when you were like that age, because you had like $5 and student loans. So like these were the kids. But I needed to take a cab. The cab wouldn't take me back. Right. Like, okay. And the cab, it's like, I'm not going to Brooklyn. I'm not going to Brooklyn. Like the whole thing. And like, and I am so embittered that the people that decided that Brooklyn was a place not going to suddenly decided that this land had value, and then came and conquered and basically have supplanted my culture, what I think of as like working class pan-immigrant culture, frankly, like is what it is. Like, because like I am as familiar with I always say I'm as familiar with a beef patty as I am with a roti, as I am with like 900 different Chinese dishes. And I the other day I had to seamless myself like a knish, like because I was like had a craving. Like it's like so like it's across the board, like because they're the people that like and that you're growing up with, and your common thing is that you're all trying to find a baseline of how do you fit into both places, right? Like, and so I'm angered that my culture has been displaced in this way. And I think it's more a cultural displacement than it is just fancier housing and closing certain types of restaurants. And I talk about this. I've written about it a lot for The Atlantic, and I've been working on it more. But to your point about like an improvement or refinement, this whole thing around noise, like, and that's why I like when she goes to Sunset Park, the house is noisy. It's like big and it's noisy. But like, I knew that my neighborhood had hit a death knell when the first time it was the same friends at the same restaurant. And suddenly somebody was like, could you all please quiet down? And I was like, go and fuck yourselves. Like, like, and I think it's a little bit more about colonialism and liberation, like, and this idea of rejecting the colonizer. And I think, there's a tiny thing that was a very big deal for me, which is for years, I straightened my hair, like, right.
Girl, like we've been through that path.
But it's this dumb thing that's what makes you look professional. that's what makes you look good and nice. And our mothers tell us these same things. And it's like, but it is, I refuse. I have to look in the mirror and look and say that the way that I was made was also beautiful. And like, and I think that that is, and I say that even just to go back to the colors and thing. Like, I think that it's also like literally a bit about like accepting like, okay, and this is also beautiful and you are also beautiful, but I'm not going to let anybody shit on you for that, if that makes sense. Like, you know, like it's like it's, I think too often, particularly in Latinx culture, we have assumed that, you know, that mentality, the colonized mentality, and we forget. Sorry, I'm like, I hope my friend Pau isn't on here, but I'm like, but literally, like, we forget that it's like it was the Spanish that told us that dark skin was bad and that all these other things. And so, like, it's literally, it's not just an American thing; it's even deeper than that. And we have to like look at what are these things that are internalized. And I really wanted, I wanted to question that, and I wanted her to have gone to this most elite school so that she's like the one who's like starts out being like, well, look. And that's why like the Mateo character, you know, I never really gave a good baseline, but she ends up having this one night stand that you think is going to be a one night stand. And it turns out to be with this guy who is a self-admitted hoarder. He's this like biracial guy, also from Brooklyn, but he's gone to like one of these like fancy New England, like kind of private colleges, and now sort of just as real estate. And he'd gone into investment banking and sort of admits to having had this little bit of a breakdown. And I always think of him as like being like more emotionally advanced than her, if that makes sense. It's like he had walked the path that she had walked and had come to a place of peace. Like, and so I feel like he ends up being this pebble in her shoe. It's not so much her family or even her mother getting back in her life as much as she felt like she's from this place that's kind of going extinct. She feels like an alien, like really, like, and I can say like, you know, we were talking a little bit before we got started about the college parts. And, you know, I think the college parts are so important because she did all the right things, right? She's
all
like,
the things.
her and her grandmother, they're like, I'm going to go, I'm going to do all of the, I'm going to study, I'm going to do all the, you know, all of the extracurriculars, and I'm going to get into the best school I can. And then she goes there and she literally has nothing in common with anybody, because most of the minority kids come from like prep for prep, and they're from like, they've already been at Edward G. Oliver and like, they've done all the things. And then she doesn't fit in with the white kids. She doesn't fit in with them. And she's literally just like wandering around lost. And then there's no plan after that. And like, I think, I don't know, I think like it was just sort of this important thing to show what happens when you don't have a roadmap, you know. And like, and I had said when I wrote a letter to booksellers, and one of the things that I wrote was, I was really curious about, I'd always been really curious about what happened to the girl after she left Mango Street. And it's like, because like, it's one thing to want to leave, but it's a whole other thing to survive leaving, right? Like, and how you reconcile that with yourself and stay true to full values. And like, and what are those values? Like, what are American values versus our values? And when do our values to play? I think we're in such an interesting point. I really have to say, like, it's like divine timing. I think the fact that this book came out at a time where we're all questioning, like, why do I have this job?
Yes.
Why do I do this thing? Like, I think it happens to be a time where we're like, are these values the right values? Is working all the time the right thing? Like, is that better than what I've been doing in the pandemic when I couldn't do anything and I was with my family all the time? Like, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
And when I think about Olga and Prieto in the book, they are both kind of facing this question, right? And they're looking around them. And I think that's why the part of their lives that they are in is so important, because they have the wherewithal to say, let me look at these letters that we have, that I've been getting from my mom, right? Like, let me see what's kind of going on with, you know, where are these messages even coming from? Do I care about the school that I went to before?
That's
like,
right.
You know, I do feel a certain way when I see this neighborhood turning over. You know, I valued being these fancy wedding planning type spaces, but I'm still facing, you know, an intense amount of discrimination in that process, right? And so it's like, and in this changing times too, of like how our culture is changing, becoming more accepting of things, and people are kind of charting their own paths that don't just see white as right, but really kind of unpacking that and having some agency within themselves to determine, kind of how they want to move forward. And what I love about that is this sense of like, it's not inevitable, right? Once you kind of fall off this cliff of like, you graduated from the fancy New England school, you get this like fancy job, then you live out your rest of your life. You still have the opportunity to look at that life and do that like very not glamorous work of really figuring out where your values are and how you want to articulate those values like into action in your life.
Well, what's a good life, right? Like, and I think that what I started to realize, it wasn't the intention when I was writing it. Ironically, my parents were like these militant socialists, and like I sort of always felt like socialism stole my family. But like, but so ironically, I ended up writing this kind of socialist book because it was more in the writing of it that I started to realize that the exact values of capitalism. And when you think about like, well, what does a successful white family look like? A successful white American family looks like, 2 kids and parents. Like, right? Like, it's like maybe 3. Like 3 is like in New York, like rich. Like you're rich. You got 3 kids in New York. Like it's like
you're a rich bitch girl. Like that's a lot of money.
It's like, like I saw somebody, I was at a fancy thing at Brown, and I was like, I know your brother, because like they literally look so much alike. And he was like, I was like, yeah, I saw him like maybe a year ago. And he's like, oh, you've seen him closer since me. I haven't seen him in 2 years. And I was like, I haven't seen your brother in 2 years.
Yeah.
Like I was like, I'm not judging you, white man, but that's weird. Like I was like, that's weird.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're rich. Like you all fly and see each other. That's really weird. But like I think this idea that of course you can spend your time always being at work because there aren't other people. You're not part of a community. And I think that what ended up being the discovered theme, a discovered theme of Olga, that part was not intentional, but it was literally in doing the research on the history of Puerto Rico and also of how Puerto Rico recovered after Maria. I realized that our families, this idea of community coming together for each other is our value. And I think what's interesting is that we're at this precipice where people are like, well, company isn't going to come for you. They're not going to come and save you. Like, like your money to a certain degree, yes, but then at the same time, not. And it's like, and what, like, I think it was interesting like that, like, as I was finishing getting this book out to market, like, it's like all mutual aid, we hit the pandemic, mutual aid societies. Like, I just think it's this idea of like, what I think we're at a fight now, like what are American values? And I think that was what I was sort of looking at, is like this idea of like, she had been like, I am trying to play in this game. And her mother tells her, the mom is like, I mean, we should probably talk about the mom, but like the mom is like this fascinating character because she's always a little bit right. And she's always a little bit messed up.
Yes. Like I've in her letters, and we like there's a recurring kind of letters that she sends to her kids, and like I think those are some of the most heavily highlighted parts of the book for me. And I'm like, I agree with this. Blanca's hella problematic, but like she's not always wrong.
Not always wrong. That's the problem. We can talk about this with my mom.
Yeah.
No, she's not always wrong. Like, she's not always wrong. And I think that was the challenge of every letter. Like, those are the things that on a craft level, I rewrote the most because I needed them to feel in the voice of somebody that was like shaped by this movement time. But also, I think this idea of a mother. Well, first of all, I think what I didn't quite realize was so universal, but that was sort of a pleasant surprise, is this idea that, mainly because I have my grandmother, but like this idea that a mom kind of forms an opinion of you at a certain age, and then it's like they stick to that. Like it's like you've always let people walk all over you, and you're like, I don't. Like it's like
I'm still scarred by this. Like when as most teenagers sleep late, right?
Yes.
And so
Yes.
even as an adult, for 2 years, I was a personal trainer, which means I had to wake up at 5:30 in the morning
Oh,
to
yeah.
get down to Christopher Street to
Of
like
course.
train my clients in West Village, right? And
Yeah.
then my mom would still be calling me. She called me at like 1 p.m. and she goes, "Oh, I'm sorry. Did I wake you up?" And I'm like, "I have been awake for hours." But she still has this idea of me as someone who likes to sleep late from when I was a child.
It's so good. Like literally, I think I loaned a friend in high school like $20 and they never paid it back. And my grandma was like, "You'll give people the shirt off your back. I can't believe you were even able to make rent." Like it was like you're just it's so dramatic. Like 30 years later, like I swear to God, like so I think part of it was this idea that it's somebody who doesn't want to see what's really happening, for lack of a better word. And then I think some of it was that she is also though insightful. Like,
Yes.
there was a letter, without giving too much away, but she at some point you find out that Olga was proposed to when she was like 25 by somebody very successful. Like, like, and he was like inspired by like I was in the club in my 20s. So he was inspired by somebody I knew from the club. And and she writes her this letter explaining why she doesn't think she should get married. And the letter is completely true, by the way. Yeah. Like, I think it's everything she hits on is more or less very, very true. And at the same time, you realize that like it causes Olga to walk away from this relationship and then she just doesn't know how to do it again. Yeah. And so like, I think like they don't necessarily always realize the impact that their words are going to have. And I wasn't expecting her to be so relatable to people that way, but she's been very relatable, I think, particularly to women of color whose moms have such like influence in our lives. She
has this very big brother type energy where, I think people who've read the book or people who have heard about the book know that this is an absent kind mother who communicates through these letters. But she has so much information about what is going on in her children's lives. And just in one direction, lays down her judgment, lays down her opinions, and you're just kind of left to, okay, what do I do with that information? But she's not active, but acts like, and in a lot of respects, still does kind of puppeteer their decisions.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, a little bit of this was based on my ex-in-laws. My ex-husband was Nigerian and Guyanese, and they really wanted them all to be doctors. Like, and it was like it was literally like, yeah, but I'm not really good at pre-med. It's like, great, you're going to be a wonderful doctor. Like,
I hate science. You're going to be a wonderful, great doctor.
I'm failing every chemistry class. Like, it's like, you're going to be great as a doctor. Like, and I think like, so some of it was a little bit inspired by what I know real parents can be like. And then some of it was a little bit my own mother. And then some of it was this idea though. I mean, the idea for her, yes, it was my mom, but it was also like, I was watching this Nina Simone documentary and I just was struck by, and I'd seen a Dolores Huerta documentary that it connected a dot for me where I was like, well, these women that are like really intense activists, you can't do everything. Like, I don't know, like you can't do everything. So it's like, and I think the idea that we have to idolize people and make them perfect in every way is also a problem. Like I think I have a reader right now that's been DMing me on Instagram who is like, I love Blanca. And I'm like, no. And I was like, no, I think that's great. I get it. I was like, but that's a very specific reader that loves Blanca. But I understand why, because they're like, I love that she is so convicted. I love, and that is a great activist mentality. You know what I mean? But I think that the idea that we think that because that's also this weird, I think we're in this phase. I'm sure you would agree and have a lot of opinions. I think we're in a myth busting phase of American history.
Speak on it. We are. And I think with so much, and this actually leads to another question that I have. But in speaking of myth busting, where you can be in your life for years and years and years, and at some point you take ownership of your own education and then what you do with that, right? And so a lot of our histories are not part of like the core curricula of American education system, right?
Yes.
But I see this kind of reclaiming of, well, what did happen? And I will look for my own primary sources and also use our stories and our experiences as knowledge, right? Right
Yes.
alongside kind of that academic quote unquote rigor and like kind
That's
of
right.
archivals and looking through that. And so I will tell you this, that I think this is actually the only novel that I've ever read next to a device, right? Next to my phone or next to my computer, because I was Googling Promesa, I was Googling
Wow.
the Puerto
Yeah.
Rican obituary, found the poem that the title is based off of,
Yeah.
stopped
Thank
reading so
you.
I could
Yeah.
read the
Yeah.
poem, right? I
Yeah.
didn't know diddly squat about Act 20 or Act 22. And I listened to a podcast you're on now, Act 60, right? I hadn't spent that time outside of what was being fed to me on my feed, but I intentionally looked at photos of, you know, when Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico in the aftermath of that. And so it's like I did this reading, right?
Yeah.
And this whole other side work of like taking ownership. Like, I don't know shit about
That's
Puerto
right.
Rico, right?
Uh-huh. No.
And
Yeah.
I have agency, as we've been talking about, to fill in the blanks, right? And see what that can mean for me
Yeah.
in my articulation, in my expression of my values. And so I'm curious if you can speak to kind of like the research process of this and what that process meant for you, especially as this being also part of your experience and part of
Yeah.
your history.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I want to talk about like American history and colonial history and how I know and how I think the white gaze is stopping us from understanding what's been really happening to us. But yes, okay. So what I will say is this. You have to understand that my parents are the type of people. I live with my grandparents. I saw my mom once a year, maybe twice a year, and then my dad like whenever. But they would send me like Marks for beginners, an illustrated book. Like, so to say that like all of this was like new would be a lie. Like, it's like it was all kind of back here. And my mom was not a young lord. She was involved in the takeover of Brooklyn College, and she started, she was like, her first job after college was in the Black and Puerto Rican Studies department that they founded and stuff. And then she ended up she was very involved with the Socialist Worker Party. And so she did go down to fight for reparations in Puerto Rico. And then she ended up going to LA and meeting my dad, and who was in the Chicano power movement. This is to say that like, I knew the baseline, right? And I was like, well, I'm going to make them young lords because I just thought that that was something relatable and tangible and that I wanted to call attention to, because one of the main things that I was fascinated by just in my own life was like that my mom and my dad were so on like anti-materialistic on the left, blah, blah, blah. And then I became this wedding planner. I literally spent the first 5 years after college being like, but how can we get into Puffy's white party? Like literally, like it was like, but where will we stay? Like it was like, who has a share? Like really, like it was that vapid. And you're like, okay, like how did it go from there to there? And I thought that was really interesting. And I wanted to kind of remind my community that we have these roots of activism, that this has been erased from history because other people don't find it interesting. And when I talk about just history, it's to say the reason why people don't find these things interesting is not people. We find it interesting.
Yes.
That white America feels ameliorated when they like politely plasticate themselves about slavery, right? Like, and then every other narrative about history and things that they've done to other people and people of color doesn't make them feel better at all about their guilt. No. So they just choose to ignore it. But the problem is that then we don't see who we're dealing with, because I was looking at the story about Haiti that was in the New York Times, about Citibank and all the corruption that had happened and the takeover in Haiti and how it was fueled by Citibank. And it's literally all of it, that the occupation of Mexico and turning it into Texas, Puerto Rico, the everything that happened with the Philippines, like all of that all came after we had made slavery illegal. And so we just sort of took these racists and gave them some new places to conquest. And when we don't see it as like enabling conquest and enabling domination of brown bodies, we miss out on the larger point, right? Like, and I think that part of what I started to discover when I was doing the research was I was like, oh my God, like this is literally tied to like, it's still this idea of like, I'm going to come in with my capitalistic needs. These people don't matter. They're not going to go anywhere anyway. And like they're not going to accomplish anything. Like, what difference does it make? And this diminishment of brown, it's the same story, a diminishment of brown life in order to validate and justify white capitalism, right? Like, and I think that, and that's why I say I didn't intend to write such a socialist book, but capitalism is the main indicator, particularly white imperial American capitalism, right? Like, and so I just think that what I came to, though, as I was doing the research, was like, I knew, oh my gosh, and I know, I mean, you've done a TED Talk, so you know, you can't say anything as a non-white, I want to say man, because I think white women feel the same pressure about this, but like, you know, it goes in degrees, right? Like, you can't say anything without triple, quadruple checking it. Like, you're like, what? Like, no, I if there's even a tiny bit of doubt. So I ended up I did the research a lot as I went along. Does that make because I had been in a group, Minjin Lee had come to a book club of mine.
I'm obsessed with her, by the way.
Oh my God, obsessed with her. And
also from New York.
Oh, obsessed with her. Also from Queens. She's a Queen.
Yeah, she is very Queens, and I love that.
So Queens. But she talks about how she wrote Pachinko twice. And once is because it was so researched that it became academic. And the next time kind of made it real. And I was like, I don't want to lose that. I don't want to like get mired in the research. So I would research as I went along, and I would keep Evernote. But by the time I got to, let's say, like, there's a later letter where Blanca, the mom, is talking to Prieto, a congressman, about his vote for Promesa, which was a oversight board that is now maybe going to lose power, but has been controlling Puerto Rico fiscally, essentially in every way. But and there are government appointees, and a lot of them are corrupt, corporate leaders. And so she tells him, as I find activist parents do, she tells him the history of his own people, even though he knows it because she's told him before. But when I was researching that and really laying that out, what I felt emerge was an insane amount of pride, like orgulloso, right? Like, it's like because I have been told, this is when I get like really like emotional. Like, I feel like we had been told like, oh, like, you don't do well in school and you don't do these things and you're the exception and everybody else is this. And it's because you guys aren't smart and you can't stay in one place and blah, blah, blah. And then I started to see this is like this historic thing. That like actually we've always fought back and kept like a resilience. There was like this resilience, and the resilience was to not take our joy away. And I think that to me was I wrote it because I was proud, and I never felt like I was a good Puerto Rican. And I was like, I want to write about how proud I am about this thing. And I wasn't a good Puerto Rican personally because like I had been through all these institutions that were like, quiet down, blah, blah, blah. Like you're like I feel like, oh, I'm not supposed to do these things. And I really wanted to write and celebrate it. And I also think like by the end, when I wrote the end, I was like, I really do feel like there's a path forward that doesn't rely on this American affirmation. And I just felt like we are not the things that you've told us that we are. Like, it was very healing for me, my own self, because I think I had not put into historic context, like this idea of being a half citizen and being economically oppressed and being exploited and having your diet based on tariffs and like your cuisine based on colonial imperialism. Like, it's like all of these things. And it's like, and then you end up realizing your whole family's fucking diabetic. And you're like, oh, okay, because we can't get vegetables. What the fuck? Like, it's not that we don't make good choices. It's like we have been we've been cornered, backed into corners. And so I think, but then when I saw that there's a history of fighting against that, like, and that we're not told about it. We've not been told. And that was why the title was so important to me, because I wanted to connect it to the last big movement. And the last big movement of being like, no, you're not going to do this to us. And remind us that that is one dot in a lineage of dots. And I do feel like I'm seeing now, I mean, and when I was editing it, the summer of 2019 happened with everybody coming to the streets, you know, like, and I'm seeing now, you know, it's through music, it's through art, it's Bad Bunny, it's this book on a diasporic level, but like, it's like, we are saying like, no, like, no. And so I just, I don't know.
No. Like, a lot of what you're reminding
storyline, if that makes sense. Does that, like, I don't know
say
how
that
to
again?
The research started to inform the story.
The storyline,
It was like, especially as it gets later and later.
Yes. And as you talk about, like, okay, you have this map up until the fancy white college, and then what happens with your life. What I felt towards the end of the book, which I will say towards the end, getting through chapter by chapter was very difficult. I think that's the slowest part of the book for me, because it was, I started to feel implicated in the actions of it, right? In terms of, I don't know if I would describe the ending of the book like hopeful, but I see a roadmap of what it means to have your own voice, right? And to put that alongside of making space for joy, making space for your authenticity, and creating a good life based on that, you know? And kind of what you're saying reminds me, there was this, I forget where it was, but a Black Lives Matter protest. There's this image, all Black and brown people just all over the streets. And right in the middle of that was a couple getting married, right? Full tuxedo, full wedding gown, getting married in the middle of a Black Lives Matter protest. And like that level of pride, not just for Black Lives Matter, but like for all of our movements across all of the diasporas, the true nature of our history is that resilience, but alongside like who we all are as a people, those things have always existed hand in hand. And I feel like a lot of the characters in the book reach some reckoning with kind of building their own roadmap in that way.
I think that that's right. And I think, well, I think it's so interesting, because I think like it's been talked about in discourse more around, like, let's say like slave narrative, right? Because like, it's like, it always gets represented as like the rapes and the beatings and this and that. But then there's not the idea that there were weddings, let's say, like there were like, and I always say this, my best friend and I always say this about like immigrant narratives. It's like I have never known an immigrant that's not been, I've been going to an immigrant birthday party for like my whole life. Like,
yep.
There's always a birthday party, like every weekend there's a birthday party, and you never see that like in a story on the screen. Like, it's always these points of trauma. And I think that but I guess, I don't know, we chatted a little bit about this. It's a good weird segue, which is like a good segue to white gaze. Because that wedding in the middle,
it's on my notes here, gaze.
Because the wedding in the middle of a BLM protest is basically saying, fuck your white gaze. We're also having joy in this, and that we are protesting, but we live also in joy. And I think that the white gaze says, I just want to see the trauma so I can feel something.
Yes, please. Can you bleed for me? Tell me about the very worst things that have happened to you and your cousin and your auntie and to your people, right? Just so I can be emotionally moved.
I can be emotionally moved to empathy. Like
to empathy, not even action.
Emotionally moved to empathy. Can you
Yes.
please torture yourself so that I can be emotionally moved to empathy? And I think that this was a rejection of that.
Yes.
And I think, but then it's interesting because like, and I want to say, look, I'm almost 45. And I am the first person to say, like, I grew up in a very different time as a woman, right? Like, and so, and I grapple with it. I'm grappling with it. I grapple with it constantly. But like, I've had a lot of pushback on there's so many spoilers on the internet. Like, there's an assault towards the end of the book. Okay, there's an assault towards the end of the book.
Yeah.
And I have had people say she gets over it too quickly. She's over the trauma too quickly. And I want to talk about that because
Yes.
I say, look, I didn't write that as somebody that's never experienced a sexual assault. Like, but it's also like, you are a business owner. You are in the midst of a number of other crises. And it does not mean that there are not underground reverberations, but there is this, like, I have to make some peace with it. And she ends up going to therapy and doing a lot of work after that. But I think this idea that to that point, have we been conditioned that we are supposed to bleed about that in order to make somebody feel something about it? Even though I think part of it is that, like, most women read it and are like, oh God, like, and it's like, and we know that you have to keep going. And that's actually like, and it's like, is art. And I think that then you get into this thing of like, well, what is art and what is catharsis? And I don't know. And I think, to me, I wanted to make art about the lived experience of a Latina woman in New York, right? Like, and it's like, and the lived experience is, there isn't a ton of time to sit around, like, to do, like, I know it sounds really cold, but like, there isn't a ton of time. And I think the other thing is, it wouldn't be authentic to me. Well, each character kind of symbolizes something in the book, and there is no way for that other character that commits the assault to not commit the assault, because that is who that character is. Like,
And you know what's interesting about that character too is that there is this sense where I'm similar to how Trump is described in the book, even though Trump was not named, as a useful idiot.
Yeah.
Where I saw the storyline, like, this, our gaze of his gaze is important, right?
Yeah.
And there were parts of his story that I'm laughing at, like, this guy is so dumb. Right?
Oh, totally. Right.
Like, so entitled, so dumb. And you kind of want to snicker at, like, these white men. And I feel this way. I think we talk about even Trump in this way. Like, look at this moron, look at this, whatever. But and like, at the end of the day, he was still president. At the end of the day, he still wielded this power. And that sense of, I don't want to say an inevitability, but when that happened, I felt, because in pages before, I'm laughing at him.
Yeah. Oh,
and that is how quickly things can shift, because that's where the power lies.
That's right. That is right. And I think it's like this idea of the person in power doesn't necessarily, but that's the problem with meritocracy, right? And I think a little bit of this book is also questioning meritocracy.
Yes.
Because it's like the idea that we've been conditioned to think that somebody in his position must be brilliant, must be so like wise and thoughtful and caring. And in actuality, they're kind of haphazard, like, hey, and I think that is its own thing. And somebody's family resonated with me most. And I do just want to say, like, I thought it was so important to write family and family the way that, like, like, I think the idea that, it's like this idea that, like, there's politics at home and at work. Like, it's like she's navigating all of these, like she's navigating these tiny challenges amongst her, like, family, like, dynamics. And also this idea of roles. Like, I thought this idea of roles being so, I don't know. I just thought that was something that was interesting to think about and talk about. Like, it's like, she says in the beginning, like, everyone's going to think it's this because about the napkins, because that's her role. And And then at the end, that's exactly what happens, because we do kind of have these shorthands in family too. And I just sort of thought that was, like a fun thing.
There's and I think to our first point, like there's so much richness in this book, and I think depending on who you are, you're going to pull out different things. And before we started broadcasting, I just want to revisit that conversation around gays, right, where you were saying how a lot of people, or these, when you write in the tradition of Toni Morrison, you are writing in the tradition of your own gaze. And there's this way that you have to, as we've seen Toni Morrison do, defend that gaze as valid, as true, as legitimate, without needing this like white gaze, right? And that if people are asking you, who is this book for? It's typically a white person who can sense that this book is not for their gaze.
I did a book club a couple of weeks ago, actually. It was like a belated book club commitment, and the host said, I mean, but there aren't many people like this woman that you wrote. And there was literally like,
what?
There were literally two. I mean, I was like, what are you talking about? It was for an alumni organization for one of my schools. I won't say which one. And I was like, there were literally two other like Latinas, very, very well, like, you know, like totally. I was like, I just did an event in Long Island with 100 other Latinas just like me. Like, I was like, but this idea that like, I think that's what's so interesting. And I think that it challenges some people. It's been challenging for some people to sort of, I like, the simple thing is to be like, oh, but it's your life story. And I'm like, it's not my life story.
No.
It's not my life story. It's like, it's not, it's got some inspiration there. I just thought weddings were a fun way to talk about class, you know, like, like that was just like a fun, why not use that? Right. But like, it's interesting. The gaze thing does bother people.
It does. Really and I freaking loved it. Like when I shared this to you on Instagram, I was like, when Xochitl started talking about quarter waters, I knew I was home. I knew.
Oh my gosh, I love it. No, and I think that was important too. Is like this idea of like, so well, that actually, it's really funny. I was doing a My Spots thing for Curbed, you know, like places you like to go, and the woman was like, "Did you write Brooklyn so well so that people that had never been here could feel like they've been here?" And I was like, "Oh, I never thought at all about people that had never been here. I was literally like, oh my God, wouldn't it be hilarious if I could put in Caesar's Bay?" Like I was like I was literally writing it to plant as many Easter eggs as possible for New Yorkers. Like I just thought that would be fun, right? Like
I caught them. And you know what's interesting? I caught a lot of the like general New York things as someone who's from Queens, or like, and even you talking about how people in other boroughs call Manhattan the city. I didn't even notice that as something that would be weird to someone who's not from New York.
Totally.
Where it's like, oh yeah, I'm going to the city, and it's it's like, you mean Manhattan? That's like so like I caught a lot of the New York type things, right? And I caught a lot of the dynamics of kind of like the textures of when you're in New York, part of these different communities, adjacent to these communities, and also being from somewhere else and having these Caribbean roots, right? But the parts that were like deep South Brooklyn and the parts that were like deep Puerto Rican, I was not bothered by not being included in that. And I think that is what's so important.
That is what's so important, right? Like that is what's so important. It's like, why does that? Like, why do you feel everything needs to be centered around you? And I think that we're coming into a place where that's, you know, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about this. Like we have to, it's not just about, I just did something for Allure, and it was like the first ever melanin edit. And the reason why I loved it, it's like, it was the first time ever where the assumption is a white beauty plus, like, it's like, I'm going to move the focus here for a second and you'll get a little bit, but like, you know, like the focus is here. And I think it's this idea of writing a story and centering it on the experience that has always been called the other, and being like, no, like that's not the other. From my purview, that is not the other. And I think, you know, and it's I won't even lie. Like it can be a challenge, not mentally, but it can be a challenge, like technically.
Yes.
That makes sense.
Okay,
Like,
I do
yeah.
want to ask you about that. And if you have a few extra minutes,
Yeah. Yeah.
if people have questions, populate that in the chat, and I'll do a quick kind of rapid fire around like craft and business that I want to address. It is
Yeah.
technically difficult to write from your own gaze, which is so tragic. And like little things that I'll do, instead of saying like, oh, people of color, professionals of color, I'll say us. And it's
Yeah.
like, I know what us means, right? And if that us doesn't include you, then you got to kind of sort yourself out. So I'm
That's
curious,
right.
like, in the actual work of what it means to write from your own gaze, or the work technically of kind of grounding your story in authenticity.
Yeah.
Like, what's hard about that, or like, and technically, like, how did you do that?
So in this book, it weirdly felt a little bit easier because I made some rules. Like I was like, okay, if you think in Spanish, I'm not italicizing Spanish. If
I did notice that, and I
if
love that.
if it's something that I think everybody would know, like what it means, like a coquito or whatever, like I'm not gonna like of the community, I'm not going to explain it, and that was pretty simple. Where it gets more challenging is when usually it's her, she's moving in white spaces and how she sees things. And that's definitely in my next book, where it's like a younger woman, like a 20-year-old in college, moving through an all white college that's segregated. That's challenging because you're like, because some of it is how do you show that she's wondering what it's like on the other side versus like and rooting it. And I'm dealing with that now, but like I think in general it was easier with this book to make ground rules. Like does that like it's like, well, do I need it, would my friend need it, like, and if they don't, then I'm not going to do it. And I think that and the other parts were like, I thought it was really funny. Like one person was like, oh, like Reggie's dialogue is so expository. And I was like, oh, I just sort of thought Reggie was a hotep. Like I was just like, I kind of thought he was so clearly just a hotep. Like he was like, I'm going to over explain everything to you. Like that was just like a personality type that
Reggie felt very real.
He was like this hotep-y guy, like, which is okay. Like, like, so I think that I tried to like really, a lot of it is defining character, but a lot of it is like, I'm not explaining anything. If the character would think that way, I'm not explaining it. And I do think the best thing that any writer could do is to take at least an acting class. Like, and I had gone to like a theatery high school. So like, I do try to like really think like the character, and I work through a lot of my problems like a character, right? Like, and I think it's like this person. So when Olga is the most self-conscious of everybody, like she's the one that thinks the most about what a white person would think. But most of the other characters don't care because they have their own reasons to be able to not care, right? And so like that was a good way to get through that rule, I think. Yeah.
And so when I did something similar for my TED Talk, I had so much pushback. Some might say feedback. I will say pushback on, well, you need to explain this. And I'm like, well, I don't need to explain it because the people who I'm doing this for, they know what I'm talking about. And so once you get into this like publishing world, how did you navigate if you had similar experiences where people are like, I don't think our reader will get that, or we want to appeal to a broader audience, that type of coded language of I don't think white people understand.
I got very lucky with publishing. Like, to be completely honest, I didn't get a ton of that. Like, there was like one weird thing where they're like, were people saying Latina then? And I was like, yeah, it was an academic phrase, and the mom went to college and she would totally have said it. But on the TV adaptation side, it's like nonstop. Like, oh my God, are you kidding? And like, and at one point they were like, it doesn't feel clear. And I was like, are they illiterate? Because there's subtitles. Like, I just like, I didn't care because I got to hear so late in the game that I was like, I don't see what's confusing if you read, like, like, and so that
is right there.
Like, I think it was hard. It's harder in the television. I don't, and that was actually before everything got very, very like quote unquote woke in publishing. Like I just, I had a couple people that when I was going out to auction that were like, this book would be great if we got rid of all the politics. And it's like, okay, great. I don't want to auction you my book. But like, I think that like the people that were interested in it genuinely weren't trying to change that. And I got very lucky in that sense. But it's probably also a moment in time too,
Yeah, and I think what I've experienced, because this is not public information, but I'll be seeing you at some author things soon.
Oh, I'm very excited. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, okay. But I think I had to be very brave in when I got different offers. I said no to a lot.
Yeah.
And I think that if I was 10, 15 years younger, I would have been like, yep, please, thank you. Oh, do you want me to change this? You want me to change that? Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And so I think there is something to having these opportunities later when you're a little bit more unapologetic about your own authenticity, because you can say, no, F you, I'm not going to give you my book. I'm going to find someone where I can have a better relationship with to see my vision.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I definitely have felt the power of saying no. And I've felt the power of telling people that they're racist.
Girl, it's the best thing.
It's the best thing. And
keeps
now,
me young.
And that was before I was a New York Times bestselling author. Now you can't tell me nothing. You can't tell me nothing.
Yeah.
I'm literally like, okay. Like, no, like, I'm like, that's racist. Like, no, literally. It's my favorite thing now, and I really enjoy calling people out on it. And like, and I definitely, I don't know, like, I think I said this to a friend of mine who's in corporate America, but I was like, the sad martyrdom of George Floyd on top of all this is that I do think, while many things have not changed, it has let us say, no, back up. Like, no, in a way where I think there was a little bit more of like, let me try and explain this to you. And blah, blah, blah. And like, there's like a, nope, I'm sorry, I'm calling you on this, and that's not going to happen. And I can't let you exhaust me anymore. Like, and that is, I will say, like, that has been a good thing. And I'll say one other thing, just like, Teresita Fernandez, the artist, called me, and she's this amazing Cubana American artist, and she called me up when she'd heard about the book. I'd known her loosely for a few years, and she was like, I want to just tell you something. She was like, you have to control your own messaging. There is very little about, and I'm so fortunate because everybody at Flatiron understood completely. And along the way, like in every single thing that I've been doing since then, there is very little that I don't have a finger on. Because, and I think that that's important because, to your point, they don't understand us.
Yeah.
Like, and we have to control how we're being packaged also, because that's so important too. Like, it's like how I knew what I wrote, but then there's a whole point of Olga where it's like, but how is she being, there was a, just by way of example, this is one example in the back of the blurb, like, where it tells you what the book is about. There was one version where it didn't talk about Hurricane Maria at all.
Wow.
And it was like, get out of here, because I think they wanted to frame it a little. There was like a part of probably some small division of the marketing team that was like, we can market it as a rom-com if we don't talk about the deadliest hurricane in Puerto Rican's history. And I was like, no. Like, and you have to, like, I think it's being a little bit older. It was kind of the time. And it's like, what was the point? What was the intention behind the work? And the intention behind the work was to create a pride in Puerto Rican readers, to create a pride amongst readers of color, and to let us all make us all feel complicit in the idea that we have this colony still. And so, like, to not talk about that feels ridiculous. So
yeah. Can I ask you 2 more questions?
Yeah.
Okay. Or actually 3 questions. But you can chunk them if you want.
Okay.
Just to get to, like, the meat and potatoes, like, what is your writing process, and what was your route to publishing? Like, at what point were you agented? How did you make those decisions? Just like the kind of logistics of it. If there is anyone who's watching this that's like, I have this great idea, I have a book, but I don't,
Yeah. Look, this is one of those stories where I weirdly, like, benefited a lot from being a little older. I had been a wedding planner, and I'd had a blog that was very popular, and somebody had asked me ages ago, suggested that I write a book about being a wedding planner. And so they had introduced me via email to an agent, And I wrote a proposal and they were like, I love your writing, but it's so dark. They're like, we'll never be able to sell this. I was like, the feedback. And so I was like, okay, great. But like, I thought she had great feedback. And I was like, cool. I never thought about it again. 5 years went by. And then I finally decided, I was like, I should just try creative writing. I started out writing memoir. And then I realized that it was just too sloppy. Like it was like my real life is even crazier than this book, to be completely honest. Like I was like, oh my God, this is too crazy. Like it would be easier to make a nice little narrative. And so I started to like kind of think about what that might be. And I went to Bread Loaf, and then I went to Bread Loaf and I got so much better that I was like, I'm gonna go and get my MFA. And then I applied, and my friend Clavis Natero, whose book just came out, she was like, you don't have kids, you don't have a husband, you should totally apply to Iowa. And she's like, it's fully funded. But I was like, you're right, I should. And so I did. And I ended up getting in. And one of my best friends, my friend Sharon, was like, I can't give up my apartment to go to Iowa. And she was like, because it was a rent stabilized apartment right near a park. And she was like, it'll take you twice as much time. So right around that time, I must have had, I had the idea for Olga. And by that spring, I had like 150 pages. And I was in a locker room at a fitness class. And my childhood best friend is a publicist in publishing. And she said, do you know Molly? Like, she is this amazing agent. And I was like, no. And she's like telling her about me. And she's like, send me the first 100 pages. It's great. And it turns out it was the same agent that I'd met so many years before. But because my name doesn't sound the way it's spelled, and her name is spelled differently than it sounds, like we didn't realize. And so I got my agent kind of by happenstance. But I will say that if you are in the circumstance to do a funded or partially funded MFA, that in a later life, like that was great, because it basically gave me a year of time. Like, I mean, I had 2 years in the program, but I had a year where I didn't have to work. And I just was able to really work on this book. And when you talk about process, that's great for me, because right now I'm sequestered in a rental upstate, because I do best when I can work from like the second I open my eyes. Until like creatively, like I can revise like, along the way, like, but creatively, like the more time I have to sit there and like Google and blah, 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 like it's better. And that is not that easy to do with like interruptions, it's not, it doesn't go as well in a stop start for me, like I wish I was a different kind of writer, but like I'm not.
No, I totally feel that. And what I love about your story too is that I think there's this, as we talk about the myth of meritocracy in the book, but it's like we think that there's one way that this happens.
That's right.
And getting published has so many different ways that can happen. And so thank you so much for being transparent about your process.
Well, no, because I remember being a recent graduate and seeing people that I knew be like, oh, I have a book coming out. And they never told you like, oh, because my aunt is an agent or blah, blah, blah. Like nobody says anything. And the other thing is that I remember when I got to Iowa and I told Sam Chang, but that said, I did move to Iowa. I was like 20 years older than my classmates. And I said to the head of the program, I was like, Sam, I basically had to raise myself to have the confidence to go to this, because I met a young Latino, he's great, Ruben, he's amazing, my classmate, and now he actually works at my publisher as an editor.
I know him.
You know Ruben, he's amazing.
I know Ruben, yeah.
Ruben went from Harvard to Iowa, and
that's crazy.
I could never imagine doing that. Like I never would have had the audacity to say, like, I'm going to go and become a writer and go to Iowa. Like, so I think I had accumulated social capital, but I had also accumulated this weird confidence to like say what I really wanted to do. And the two things combined allowed me to actually do it. And I think that is also part of the journey, right? Like, I think I never would have been able to do this younger. Not at all.
Yeah.
Not at all.
And so I think with that, I want to end on this question, which is really important to me. I'll share a brief story that I shared when I talked to Bassie Ikpe about her memoir, I'm Telling the Truth, but I'm Lying, that I had always wanted to write. I've been writing journals like forever. I remember being in the 7th grade and I don't know, I was answering a question, and in my answer, I remember saying, I want to write a book someday, but that's probably not going to happen. I said that in the 7th grade, right? And Mary Teresa Barrett, bless her heart, this old white Irish woman, she's like, I don't know why you're saying that. You know, if you want to write a book, then you can write a book. And even that same voice has kind of stuck with me, even as I've had all these other careers and done all these other things, right? And so now I'm on this path and way closer to it now than I was before. And what kind of was that impetus for me is I had like a very serious health diagnosis. And the day I got diagnosed, I had Hamilton tickets, which I don't even remember. I don't even remember. I don't remember being in the theater. That is how like spaced out I was.
Yeah.
But I do recall the song where he's like, why are you writing like you're running out of time?
Yes. Oh my God. I think about that song all the time.
And I remember just weeping in the theater, and I'm like, I'm going to die. And I never wrote, I never did this thing. And like, I mean, I'm here now after I went through that whole surgery thing. Part of the aftermath of that was partial paralysis. And so I was even contending of like, how do I write a book if I literally cannot write? Like I had to relearn how to write. I had to relearn how to type. Like when I was in the hospital, I was dictating essays like on my phone because I couldn't use my hands. And now I'm like unapologetically on this path of like getting this book out. And what is always with me is what is going to be my legacy and what is the legacy of my work, right? And so I want to ask you as our final question is like, what do you hope to be the legacy of Olga Dies Dreaming? What do you hope to be the legacy of your literary contributions to the American canon, right?
Yeah. Oh my God. First of all, I love this question, but I also love that you came at it that way. Like I did something very audacious, which it was like, I think I was halfway through Olga and I started keeping a record of all of my notebooks and things. And I was like, well, I'll need these for an archive. And I thought that was very audacious, but like at the same time, I felt like this is very true. I won't lie. I think I really want the legacy of Olga to be to reinsert the Puerto Rican experience into the literary history and the literary telling. I want it to be like an American story about a diasporic people that is up there with, it's like, you have to read this, like if that makes sense, like, and an urban telling of that, like the Nuyorican people, because I feel like I think we are going extinct. Like I think like we are like being made extinct, and I wanted to make sure that there was something that was crafted as beautifully as I thought it, and I didn't. I don't know that I set out to write it where I was like, make this like a textbook, but my agent is really brilliant, by the way, because like there was like one scene that was a little bit more sexual, and she was like, you should take this out. And I was like, why? I was like, let her be sexual. And she was like, or let it be taught in high school. And when she put it to me that way, I was like, okay, like, because it wasn't that she was trying to diminish it. She was actually trying to expand it. And I was like, okay. I was like, you're right. I was like, let me sleep on it. And I think you're right. But like, and I think in terms of my work, at large, I really, I think that the Latin experience has gotten flattened by media. Okay. And I think that there are two very valid Latino experiences. There is the immigrant experience, and then there is the very firmly ensconced in American experience of how do I keep who I am while being American and of this other culture. I want to keep my work being an important part of what that is, to struggle with that other experience. Like, and in that way, in doing so, to disallow the white gaze to flatten us any longer, and to start to round us out as a cultural experience within this binary of sort of like the African-American experience and like the white experience. I think that I think there's such important work Caribbean literature work, API literary work, Native literary work that is forcing us to sort of widen the aperture. And I'd like to see my work be a part of this redefining in the literary space and the nonfiction space of like, what is American writing?
Yeah.
And pull that away from it being white centric, like, and just to have one tiny part in that. So
yeah. Well, you wrote the absolute living hell out of this book. Like, I cannot tell you, like, your hopes for your legacy. I feel this even in this one work. And so thank you so much for your time, so much for your generosity, for the extra time, so much for your passion and everything that you put onto the page. I cannot wait to see the TV adaptation, and I'm just waiting for the next series of works that you put out. Thank you so much, Xochitl. I really appreciate you.
And thank you so much. And thank you everybody that came today. And this is beautiful. And I can't wait to see you again.
Yes, maybe I'll see you at the Flatiron offices.
Yes, I hope so. Oh my gosh. Okay.
Alrighty. Bye, everyone.
Bye.